Jax Teller from Sons of Anarchy is real. Sort of. Hi, welcome to Belated Binge Sons of Anarchy. I'm Zach, your host, revisiting some of the most iconic series in recent memory that I nearly missed, like Sons of Anarchy, and today is our first topic episode on the main feed. Jax Teller is real. Let's do it.
The Belated Binge Podcast.
Before we get into it, shout out to the Patreon bonus binge squad. Bonus binge squad. Alex and Katie. More on that later. I tease this episode with the whole Jax Teller is real, right? Which we know isn't actually true. Jax Teller is a fictional character named after the child of the creator, showrunner, and actor who plays Otto, Kurt Sutter, and the actress who played Gemma, Katie Segal. They're married. They have a son named Jackson. That was the name inspiration for the character on the show. Ta-da! Jax is real. No, that end of the episode. No, that's not what we're doing. But the show itself, inspired by Hamlet. Many, I believe even Sutter himself, has said it's Hamlet on motorcycles. Very fictional. Very fictional. But the Sons of Anarchy Motorcycle Club is inspired by real-world one-percenter motorcycle clubs. Prominently, the Hells Angels. Sonny Barger, who I'm pretty sure I have all of this right in my head. If not, I apologize. No offense meant in any way. But I'm pretty sure that he was the Oakland chapter for the Hells Angels founding president, I think. What I know that he was the biggest Hells Angel that we recognize and that we know, and that he was a consultant for Kurt Sutter for the show. He played Lenny the Pimp, who was a club member who was incarcerated like Otto. And I think that it's a fair bet that Sonny Barger, or Sonny Barger, to be honest with you, I've heard it pronounced both ways from different sources that I think are fairly reputable. So I'm going to go with Barger because it rolls off my tongue a little bit easier. But I would say that he's the reason that you have ever heard of the Hells Angels in the first place. He was the face of that organization that brought them into mainstream back in whatever the 70s or whatever it was. Movies were made hugely relevant in pop culture. He essentially turned the Hells Angels into a brand. He made them synonymous with America essentially. And he's not the only one. The actor who played Happy, David Labrava, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was a Hells Angel and was a key advisor on the show. My understanding in just kind of hearing about the show is that he was kind of the culture regulator on the show. He was the one that made sure that the club stuff that they did on the show would come across feeling authentic. And he wasn't the only Hells Angel on the show either. Those two, I guess, weren't the only ones. There were supporting cast members, a couple that we haven't met yet at this point in our rewatch, but that are coming up. A couple of SAMCRO members that are coming were Hells Angels members. I've also recently learned, literally as the time I'm recording this, it was 2 days ago, or maybe a day ago. I don't know. Time has no meaning. But I was listening to the audiobook of Charles Falco, who was a CI, an informant who infiltrated the Vagos, for a minute in the Mongols and in the Outlaws, and there's a book about it. They also did a TV show about it based on the book. He mentioned in the book that he recognized and learned that there were like a lot of extras in the Sons of Anarchy show that were part of the Vagos motorcycle club. Probably other clubs, I'm guessing. I'm guessing not the Outlaws, though. That joke's only going to make sense to a couple people that are listening or potentially watching this, but maybe a few more will get it later in this episode. All that being said, Sons of Anarchy is fake, right? It's fiction. It's not a biography. It's not a documentary. It's a dramatized, sensationalized, like Hollywood depiction meant for entertainment purposes only. But it is rooted in reality. And Jax Teller is no different. There's two interesting things that I've learned pretty recently about the character of Jax Teller that I thought would make a fun topic episode for the podcast. And that when considering them together, you might come away feeling like Jax Teller is actually real. The first came from an interview that Charlie Hunnam did with the Huffington Post way back in 2015. He talked about what it was like playing Jax, what it was like coming off of playing Jax and all that stuff. Because in 2015, he had just come, like the series had just wrapped. So it was past tense for him. And he was kind of recent off of, he'd been through the whole journey, I guess you could say. So they talked about that in the interview that he did. And in that interview, he also shared something about his preparation to play the character. Apparently, back before they started shooting the pilot, Charlie Hunnam was granted permission to spend some time hanging around what he described as a prominent club with a presence in Oakland. Remember what I said before about Sonny Barger? Oakland chapter, Hell's Angels, involved in the making of Sons of Anarchy. I'm not saying anything, but might be a connection there. During this time that Charlie was researching and getting like a taste for club life, he spent a lot of time around one young man in particular. And apparently they got pretty close. Charlie himself described I'm going to call him a kid, of being Jax Teller. His father was a patch member. He'd been around it his entire life. He was the heir apparent, according to Charlie. And in the article, he depicted how much he fascinated this kid. He called him an old school outlaw cowboy. He paints this picture of a modern day gunslinger, like the quintessential outlaw. And Charlie seemed to just admire the charisma, his attitude, his presence, just everything about him. And he took a lot away from that. And apparently, the week after Charlie left, that young man was killed. He was 22. Charlie Hunnam had gotten a necklace of his, and apparently he still keeps it as a memorial to that kid. The kid who Charlie based everything he did as Jax Teller on. He said this. The jeans he wore, the shoes he wore, the attitude. Charlie Hunnam was pretending to be this young biker that he knew and had gotten to know. The real Jax Teller. I found that story fascinating because you understand that actors who play roles, they're not those people, right? They have to do research. They have to take inspiration from other people when deciding how they're going to act. They're actors. They're acting. They have to make decisions and choices of how they're going to act as the character that they're bringing to life. And Charlie Hunnam chose to base his character on a real person that he spent time with. The real Jax Teller. Just thought that was pretty cool. The second story that I heard came from the Original Gangsters podcast. That's where I heard it. In an episode that they did back in December or January, that time frame, wintertime, they were recapping some of the latest news and storylines coming out of the outlaw biker world. They're like a true crime podcast, I guess. They're like crime reporters or professors. One of them I think like teaches criminology, and I think the other one's like a crime reporter kind of a thing. It's an interesting show. They do a lot on like organized crime and mob bosses, and also they have quite a few episodes about outlaw motorcycle clubs. Those are obviously the episodes that I find the most interesting. Obviously. Well, maybe not obviously, but like it's a podcast about a TV show depicting a motorcycle club. What do you think I'm gravitating towards? Anyway, the final update that they talked about in this particular podcast episode was a story about a man that they said many call the real life Jax Teller. Again, I'm definitely gonna put a disclaimer on here, and I'm gonna do it now. I'm not a true crime podcast. I'm not a crime reporter. I'm not an investigative journalist. I have no sourcing. I have no knowledge. I have nothing about this is like firsthand knowledge for me. I heard about it on this podcast, and I read a couple of short articles that I just cross-referenced to kind of make sure that it was real. But what I heard and what I read is that Jojo Noe, or Jojo No, it's spelled Noe, and I don't know how to pronounce it, and neither did the guys on the podcast. And it's in the articles that I read. I was reading it, so I don't know here. But let's just make it all rhyme and call him Jojo No, or just call him Jojo. He's a member of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, located on the East Coast of the country. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. He's a pretty young man. He's around 30 right now, if my math is mathing. He has long blonde hair. He is a legacy member of the Outlaw Motorcycle Club. His dad is a president of a chapter on the East Coast. And Jojo has recently been put into a position of expanding the club's presence into a new town out on the East Coast, leading to the opening of a new chapter that they're putting out there. Any bells being rung for you at all here? At least that's what he was doing anyways at the time of the altercation in which this story was actually about. I'm going to kind of go backwards, but in September of 2022, Jojo was found not guilty on murder charges from an incident 2 years prior to that. In September of 2019, Jojo had gone to a known like biker hangout with his uncle and his fiance. The bar or restaurant, like whatever this place is, I'm not familiar with it. I don't even know what it was called. Has what they call a no colors policy. So basically what that means, if you haven't like gathered all of the slang from the Sons of Anarchy show or anything like that, but colors is the patch insignia for the clubs. So he was in this establishment that has a no colors policy without his cut on. From my understanding in the way that it was described on this podcast, he was essentially just grabbing a drink, maybe grabbing some food with his fiance and his uncle at this place that a lot of bikers hung out. According to the accounts described on the podcast, while they were inside, there were other motorcycle club members who knew that they were in there. And that club was the Sidewinders, apparently. And I guess that's a support club for the Hells Angels, I think, if I'm piecing all of this together. in that area. And the Outlaws and the Hells Angels have been feuding for decades. It's gotten very, very ugly at times. And I guess if you're, a Hells Angels support club, you see a big, a leader of an outlaw club, member at a place. There's opportunity there for things to not go well. And according to what was described from the surveillance tapes in the parking lot, again, I've not seen these tapes. I am just saying how it was, how the scene was described by this other podcast. The other clubs started to, members of the other clubs started making some phone calls in the parking lot and started gearing up for something outside while JoJo and his family were inside. And when they came out to leave, some either one or a couple of the club members that were out there confronted them. But it sounds like it all it didn't get out of hand or anything. It was kind of just all it really did was stall JoJo and his uncle and his fiance from getting to their bikes and leaving, which seems to be the goal, because I guess when they got on their bikes to leave, that's when a whole bunch of other bikes showed up at the restaurant, presumably what those phone calls were all about. And with what was described as I don't know, 20 to 25 club members, they boxed JoJo and his family in, and they essentially just jumped him there in the parking lot. And again, how it was described is when one of these Sidewinder club members, or I don't know necessarily if it was all Sidewinders or if maybe this was another guy from a different club or anything like that, but somebody swung, I guess, a hammer at JoJo's fiance. And that's when JoJo pulled out his handgun, which he was apparently carrying legally with a permit. And they, kind of got away from JoJo and his fiance. And they turned everybody turned their attention to the uncle. And the uncle was, he was already teamed up on, and I guess had to go to the hospital with a cracked skull and stuff like that. But at the point where there was a member of the Sidewinders who had some sort of an object, I think they said it's something like a pipe. So not like a baseball bat, but kind of some sort of pipe shaped object. Again, it's surveillance tapes that they were describing, so it's kind of hard to, those things aren't exactly HD, I don't think. And again, I didn't see them, but apparently just as somebody was swinging or getting ready to swing this pipe at his uncle's head, JoJo shot him in the back of the head twice and killed him. I guess in the he was, obviously it took 2 years to get to decision time in the courts, but I guess the jury didn't take very long to come to the conclusion that JoJo acted in self-defense. There are certainly questions that people could ask why he was charged the way he was, because they went for first degree and second degree murder charges and stuff like this. I don't know. I'm not here to litigate. I barely understand any of the legal parts at all, but even one of the short articles that I read describe or had a quote in there that said like a scene out of Sons of Anarchy. And I'm just sharing this because, one, this guy literally was described as the real life Jax Teller, has a lot of parallels to Jax on the show. Even some, granted, I've seen pictures of the guy. He's no Charlie Hunnam, but you can see where a resemblance could be made between the two characters. he's an actual outlaw biker and Charlie Hunnam is an actor. So, you know, is what it is. But I also find it ironic that he's an outlaw. And there were a lot of Hell's Angels influences in how the Sons of Anarchy made its decisions for how the club was depicted. I'm not going to sit here and say that or try to insinuate that the Sons of Anarchy was based on quote unquote the Hell's Angels, but I think there were a lot of inspirations taken from the Hells Angels and a lot of input based on how many Hells Angels were involved in the making of Sons of Anarchy. And the Outlaws have been at odds for literally decades. But this guy is part of the Outlaws, and he's kind of like been described as the real life Jax Teller. Just to me, that's irony. But the other reason that I'm just sharing this, because it does sound like a scene straight out of Sons of Anarchy. Many of the criticisms from the show come from how unrealistic people say that it is. Jax's shoes, the amount of violence. It's definitely dramatized. It's definitely sensationalized. But this stuff actually happens. Like in real life. The things that happen on that show are actually happening in the real world in various club activities that you learn about if you spend any time just absorbing media and stories surrounding that subculture, and if you love the show, as I assume that you do if you're listening or watching this and you haven't done it yet, I would recommend exploring podcasts or YouTube videos, even like books and TV shows. There's some really fascinating people who have shared their experiences from being a part of 1% clubs, notably the Hells Angels, who are so ingrained in the making of Sons of Anarchy. A few names that at least I'm familiar with and have learned a little bit about in doing this is like George Christie, who was a chapter president and a leader for the Hells Angels during the same time frame that Sonny Barger was like the main club president. From my understanding of just absorbing this stuff, they were kind of like the two most prominent names for a time in the U.S. For that club. Mel Chansey is another former Hells Angels club president that's done some really high profile interviews and talked about his experiences. There's stuff from some of those undercover operations that I like the one I mentioned earlier, the Charles Falco. There's the Jay Dobbins infiltration story. There's been like TV shows made about some of that stuff. It's really fascinating. It's really fascinating stuff. And actually, I just heard one again at the time of recording this. I just heard one. I listened to some of it last night and some of it today. A guy who goes by Mooch has a YouTube channel, but talks about his life and some of his experiences as a Mongol. There's just some really interesting stuff out there, and it does. In some ways, it does sort of make it sound like it's glorifying the the biker wars, the grenades, the car bombs, the drive-bys, freeway shootouts, different brawls that they were in, not to mention the quote unquote normal club stuff with like fighting for entertainment, drugs, parties, how they interact with women, law enforcement. Like it is, the stories are crazy that you hear, and I don't want to sit here and say that that's what motorcycle clubs are, because I also don't believe that to be true, but I do believe that it happens. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's a world that we live in where that a lot of that stuff is real and has taken place. While there's also a lot of motorcycle clubs that are not breaking the law in like any way except for maybe speeding tickets. Like The two can both be true at the same time. And while Sons of Anarchy, Jax Teller, that's all fictional. It's a fictional show, a fictional character, but it has roots in reality that's just kind of fascinating. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Go ahead and like, subscribe, follow, do all of those things. Check out Patreon for bonus episodes, some other cool stuff that I do over there. There's a free Facebook group. There's links to social media and everything in the show notes. You can also get there from the website belatedbinge.com. Remember, life is short. Buy the motorcycle. When you do, wear a helmet. Dress for the slide, not the ride, and make sure to take Belated Binge along for the ride.